IVM.
Last month, a summit broke new ground in the foreign policy space. This was the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Summit. For the first time, the leaders of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States met, virtually, of course, to discuss how they could cooperate in the Indo Pacific region. This was one of the first outreaches of the Biden presidency, and immediately it spurred conversation about the shape of the new president's policy in Asia. Is this a redux of Obama era policies or a continuation of what Trump put in place? What can we expect out of the Biden presidency in Asia? Welcome to States of Anarchy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the podcast, I break down important themes in global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. Asia is the engine of the world. And with China's rise, Asia is increasing in prominence as countries figure out how to manage their differences with China while also figuring out ground for commonalities. So, how can we think about the Quad? How is Biden's policy towards China shaping up? What about new developments in South Asia, including in Afghanistan and Pakistan? My guest for today has a lot of experience in thinking about these types of questions. Dr. Daniel Markey is a senior research professor and academic director at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. From 2007 to 2015, he was senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council of Foreign Relations. From 2003 to 2007, he served on the policy planning staff at the US Department of State. He's written a number of books. The most recent one is called China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, and it was released this year. We'll get to the conversation with Dan after a tiny break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, thewholetruthfoods.com, PayPal, Cred, and Siat. Thank you so much for working with us. We really appreciate it. First up this week, let me tell you about Cyrus Says. We featured popular YouTuber and actor Prajakta Kohli, who took us through her journey of content creation. We also had conversations with Vasanti Hariprakash and Sachin Kalbag this week. Really great conversations. Do check those out. Vineet Kanabar goes solo this time on Storytellers and Storysellers as he talks about his favorite IPL ads and how brands have been making content around the Cricket League. On The Habit Coach, Ashton was joined by Arjun and Somesh of the Fighting Goat podcast to talk about fitness for combat sports like the mixed martial arts. On Nankari, Sadaf and Archit discussed the diet and lifestyle of athletes with the host of the Millennial Athlete, Shok Ramchandra, who is also a pro badminton player and coach. Ambarana opens the 4th season of Noyer Kanun with a list of things he has planned on the show for us, including episodes on immigration law and on career prospects for law students. The IPL season's on and we've definitely got you covered. Tune into the Edges and Sledges podcast if you're looking for English, and if you're looking to listen to something in Hindi, definitely check out Khel Niti. Both are great shows with great takes. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi, Dan. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
All right, so let's dive straight into it. A lot is being talked about the Quad or the quadrilateral grouping. Why is it important, and why is it important now?
Yeah, the Quad is really, it's kind of interesting. It's become a focus or a focal point for the new Biden administration really early on in terms of its broader Asia policy. And I'm not even sure that it's something I would have predicted right out of the gate, that this administration would focus so much attention on these other 3 countries, India, Japan, Australia, and make that even more important in some ways than just focusing on traditional alliances. Although, now we're seeing Biden's also welcomed Japan's prime minister to the White House. And so that's a more traditional approach. But the Quad is interesting because it is a new grouping, and because its members, not only with India being so populous, but comprise a kind of a different geography than at least Americans have tended to think of in terms of Asia, right? It's this Indo-Pacific geography that spans, a much wider swath of territory than, say, where we used to focus, which was more on East Asia or even Northeast Asia. If you're thinking about competing with China, it was more about Taiwan Straits, Japan, maybe Korea. Now we're talking all the way across the Indian Ocean and pulling in partners that reflect that. So it's a big shift. It's an interesting one. As I say, it's an interesting signal, particularly from a Biden administration coming in, clearly intended to demonstrate to China right out of the gate that it intends to compete and that it has partners in that competition, and it's broadening out the base of those partnerships.
So we know that in the late 2000s, there was sort of an attempt to make a Quad 1.0, and that saw a lot of, pointed fingers in terms of why it failed. The US said India was pretty unwilling. India pointed fingers at Australia. And so how do we know that this time is different? Do we know that this time is different?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is an organization to even call it an organization, maybe a little premature at this point, but a grouping of states that did originally come to the forefront, I think in 2004, during the period of the tsunami. Then were brought back together, an attempt to bring them back together on multiple occasions, to actually turn that initial, very kind of ad hoc, responsive grouping into something more durable. And that faltered. And the reason it faltered was principally because at the time Australia, but we've seen other states in this grouping, didn't really want to be a part of anything that was going to so clearly be or be perceived by China as an anti-China grouping. And so effectively Australia kind of walked away from it. India wasn't always so keen on it either. Only Japan has been pretty confident about trying to build something like this all the way through. And given Japan's kind of long-standing historic competition with China, animosity, hostility toward China, that's not terribly surprising. But the thing that's changed in the interim and why they seem to have come back together is now both Australia and India perceive in China a very clear competitor, at least in some ways a very direct threat, either a military threat or an economic threat, more of a geopolitical threat. And that has brought the four of them to have a more common understanding of what they're trying to do. The other interesting thing is that even though, and we should talk about this, even though the Quad maybe hasn't actually done all that much, it has definitely caught China's attention. And in some ways, that may be its most valuable feature. In other words, it's so perturbed China, even when it seemed to be almost of a nothing of an organization, that each of the partners now probably perceives as useful to push back against Chinese pressure. So there's the political side, and then there's a certain military side in terms of joint operations and so on. And then there's sort of other, I would say, nascent efforts to turn it into an organization that does things on the economic front or on climate or on vaccine diplomacy or in other areas. So, I think there's a good chance that this Quad will persist. It's not entirely clear that the Biden administration will continue to put it front and center. I think that will depend a little bit on, just how effective it is and whether it continues to have momentum, especially with India. And if so, I can imagine it, really making some strides over the next 4 years.
The idea of China as sort of the uniting factor between these four countries is interested me because with the Quad, China is sort of the he who must not be named, the Voldemort of all sort of joint statements, right? It's never mentioned, but it's there. And so, it also makes me wonder in that sense. China's definitely taken note of sort of the Quad and has criticized it heavily in all of its outlets. So do you think that the Quad is based on sort of disputes in the South China Sea? Is it sort of more of a broad organization? I guess what I'm wondering is that we know what the Quad is not. We know that it's not sort of a formal alliance. We know that it's not an organization like the NATO. So what could it be in that sense?
Right. This is a great question. You're right that it is not yet something that looks like an alliance, and we also have pretty good reason to expect that it won't. And again, that comes back, I would say, more to India than to any of the other partners, right? The United States already has treaty alliance relations with Japan, with Australia, but not with India. And India has repeatedly expressed its reservations about that kind of a formalized relationship. We'd have to anticipate that India would have to change a lot, that India's own view of itself in the world would have to change significantly for it to sign up to a true alliance in the Quad or really anywhere else. So, thinking about its trajectory, we probably should, at least for the relative, foreseeable future, rule that out. But the Quad does, because it brings together these four countries that really, it's not just about the South China Sea or about any specific dispute that they may have with China, because they each bring different disputes with China. But it is that, increasingly Australia, Japan, and India have suffered the consequences of Chinese aggression or at least coercion in ways that are similar enough that they probably want to share notes and, if possible, team up to more effectively push back against that type of behavior going forward. And we can think about this, say, in the Indian case in particular. During this past year, when you saw China and India go toe to toe in the mountains on their disputed border, there were also steps that China and India took that were further afield. Say China launching what appeared to be cyber attacks on Indian infrastructure, or India trying to use some of its economic leverage in terms of borrowing Chinese web apps from India, or kind of keeping Chinese companies out of certain types of investment in India. Well, India can do that alone, and it has a certain effectiveness to it. But if India could team up with Japan, with Australia, who have also felt the effects of Chinese economic coercion, say Japan being denied access to rare earth minerals, or Australia not having the ability to export its wines to China, they're seeing similar types of behavior coming from China. And it stands to reason that they would then be looking for ways to coordinate their efforts, even if it's just more a matter of signaling to China the costs of these types of approaches going forward. That in itself could be quite useful. And, to the extent that the United States in the Biden administration wants to show that it is now eager to reassume a kind of a mantle of global leadership in ways the Trump administration seemed not so eager to do, the Quad is another venue for it to do so. And, the other thing I would point out is the Quad has the capacity to be a kind of a starting point for a whole bunch of other initiatives that would include the Quad members, but then could include a bunch of other players too. So you could imagine it as the starting point, as we've seen recently, for some kind of a vaccine diplomacy initiative. But that wouldn't have to stop with these four. You could bring in other countries in the region and in the world to do more on that, or on, say, maritime issues. The four can be brought together, but you could also include France or the UK or other players as well. So I think it's probably useful to think about it as flexible, a kind of a new grouping that isn't really bound by some of the older rules and routines of older groupings. And in that respect might actually be quite useful, a kind of a go-to on a variety of different fronts, maybe some that we haven't even, really anticipated yet.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that it makes me think of when it comes to sort of the Biden policy towards the Indo-Pacific is that the Obama administration with Hillary Clinton sort of saw the messaging with US policy change from sort of Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific. And then there was a lot of talk about this being the Asian century. And I guess some of that was lost during the Trump administration. So do you see sort of Biden's Asia policy continuing where the Obama administration left off, or do you see it taking a completely different path? And I asked this also because you mentioned that you were a little surprised that Quad was one of the first sort of initiatives that the Biden administration took up.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think in Washington, at least, the general at least as of today. These things change. But the consensus for today is that the Biden administration's actually taken a pretty remarkably, hawkish approach toward China. And that, to answer your first question, this is not a return to Obama or an Obama 2.0. In many ways, this is more, at least in terms of seeing China as a threat, this is more continuity with the Trump administration. But where it's a clear difference from the Trump administration is in its emphasis on allies and partners, where Trump was America first, make America great. The Biden administration is, sort of more, it takes a team. Let's build out the team. But where I was surprised about the emphasis on the Quad was, if you'd asked me before that, I might have anticipated that the first order of business for the Biden administration would be go back to basics. Go back to the tried and true treaty relationships that we have established over decades, reinforce those. So Japan is therefore a very high priority in Asia and the Asia Pacific. NATO is the priority in Western Europe. To a lesser extent, maybe Australia as well. But India comes farther down the line by that logic. India is a relatively new strategic partner. And as I said before, isn't really interested in being a traditional ally with the United States for its own reasons. So the Quad didn't seem like the place I would have started if the core storyline that you want to project is, America is back. America knows the difference between its allies and its adversaries. And the first thing we need to do is to make sure our allies know that we're actually there for them. And the Quad, is a kind of a jump beyond that, signaling to my eye an acceptance of in a sense, a bit of a reordering of the region of Asia, of accepting a broader definition of what Asia is, and of completely buying into the deal, the sort of strategic deal that now multiple U.S. Presidents have made with India, seeing India as really a pivotal player in Asia, not a peripheral one, and as central to any capacity to have if not a direct counter to China, at least a weight in Asia, a size, a heft that Australia certainly could never provide, and Japan is unlikely ever to provide. So India brings that weight and potential just because of its sheer magnitude that no one else can really match. And so I think that explains the logic. Again, I'm still a little surprised. I think now that we're seeing, a traditional, the first in-person meeting at the White House being with Japan's prime minister, I think gets us back to a little closer to where I was expecting. But times have changed.
Yeah, and I guess there is sort of perhaps some sort of continuity in US policy towards India. And that brings me to sort of China and US policy towards it. I think before Biden took power, there was lots of conversations happening on whether it was going to be, confrontation or cooperation, and sort of what sort of route Biden was going to take. And I think there is no sort of like one or the other sort of binary thinking, I guess, on this. But it makes me wonder, considering, I think, the recent meetings that took place between the Secretary of State and Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, what sort of direction do you think Biden's foreign policy towards China is going to take?
Well, I think the Biden administration has, you mentioned these meetings that took place in Alaska. They appeared to be quite contentious. We are told that things settled down a bit once the reporters left the room, that they got down to business a little bit more, and that conversations were maybe a bit more constructive. But right out of the gate, both sides wanted to show their publics and each other, the world, that they were not going to back down to pressure from the other side. And I see that as partly strategic, partly tactical, at least on the US side. The strategic point to make is that this broader one that President Biden has made numerous times, that America is back. that America is and will be a global leader and is not being supplanted by China in any serious way, has no intention of vacating the space from global leadership in the way that it seemed like Trump might be willing to do or even was doing. And so the United States wanted to put itself right back there and reclaim its place. And that is a strategic point. That's not just a narrow tactical move. That's a broader point for the Biden administration, for its agenda. The tactical issue, a kind of a diplomatic tactic and a political tactic, is that the Biden administration recalled, I think, the early Obama administration, and which looked too soft on China. Looked, by being diplomatic, by being accommodating, by trying to seek areas of cooperation rather than competition, looked like that they were almost accepting China, not just as an equal, but almost kowtowing to China's leadership. And they perceived that that was tactically a real mistake. It gave easy ammunition to China's leaders back in Beijing to use for their own people to show, we really are that powerful. It gave ammunition to critics, Republican critics in Washington, to go after President Obama and say that he was, effectively giving in to Chinese demands early on. And it put them in a bad negotiating position with the Chinese. So they knew they needed, for tactical reasons, to avoid that. So that's how I read the American side. And I think the Chinese side is in some ways a mirror of that, right? That they also have a strategic agenda to place themselves as not just a second or third rate country, but a first rate country right alongside the United States. And that seems to be very much their ambition and goal. And a tactical point of saying, we're not going to surrender any negotiating leverage. We're not going to come out nice or ask for concessions or grant concessions right at the get-go because we don't trust you and we know you don't trust us. So this is going to take a little while. So I think, all that does is, in a way, it was an opening salvo and it probably served both sides' interests, at least in establishing the bilateral relationship. It probably did what both sides wanted. It's not terribly conducive to breakthrough or cooperation, but it doesn't necessarily signal a sharp deterioration either. And I think that's important to appreciate.
Yes, I agree with you that it doesn't really mark a sharp deterioration and that China is sort of mirroring the US and how possibly it sees itself. But there are also arguments to be made that China is sort of more hardline domestically and in foreign policy today than it was 10 years ago. And under Xi Jinping, you can see this play out in various spheres. So do you think that sort of hardline is just sort of like a tactical negotiating stance? Or is that something that's going to permeate through the rest of China's diplomacy?
Oh, I don't think that China's, I should be clear, I don't think that China is taking a harder line now than 10 years ago simply for tactical reasons. I think this is very much a reflection, it seems, of the priorities and disposition of Xi Jinping, but it's hard to know. I think we have to attribute it to the wider Chinese Communist Party, to leadership circles beyond him, and to say that China's ambition, expectations for itself, expectations for its place in the kind of the hierarchy of states around the world has changed. And it has shifted from some questions about whether China would continue to, hide its capabilities and bide its time and kind of keep a lower profile, accept American leadership, and within the so-called liberal world order, continue to do well by itself and grow its power quietly. No, China is now eager to demonstrate that it has arrived, that it is capable and willing of asserting its leadership in the global context, that it has something to offer the world that is different from what the United States offers, and that it's looking to expand that influence and role globally. So no, things have really changed. And you mentioned how China has changed internally as well. And this also frames American responses to China. So the US consensus on China has also shifted drastically over the past 4, 5, 6 years. It was happening during the Obama administration. The Trump administration completely turned the page, and it became one, to simplify, of conversations about should we be competing with China as we cooperate with them. Now it's more, should we find areas of cooperation even as we are in a conflict-prone, competitive relationship. So no, the terms of the relationship have fundamentally changed. When I say that they haven't deteriorated drastically under the Biden administration, that's partly because they've already gone such a low level. The deterioration has already taken place, and I don't mean to blame the U.S. government for this. Both sides are responsible for a much sharper competition over the past, as you say, 4 to 10 years.
And I know we're not sort of in the business of crystal gazing or fortune telling, but do you think sort of in a pandemic world, in what seems to be hard to fathom, but a post-pandemic world, do you think that this would sort of make things worse or sort of like aggravate relations, considering how difficult it's been on economies and how difficult it's just been on countries across the world?
Yeah, it's hard to see how a pandemic makes anybody's life better. I mean, one could imagine a scenario in which, the countries of the world, the leaders of the world, see this as a true global threat to humanity, and we all join hands and attempt to grapple with it together because we're all mutually at risk. But so far, we haven't seen anything like that. And again, I would cast a significant amount of blame on both the United States and China for this. The Trump administration failed repeatedly to take up the mantle of global leadership and combat COVID pandemic in ways that just simply were inexcusable and out of line with what I think any other American president in modern history would have done. And so I simply can't overlook that. Simultaneously, though, I think it's pretty clear the Chinese side, hid what was going on, didn't share enough information, attempted first to cover everything up to protect itself politically, domestically, and internationally, and then did too little as the situation evolved to help other states. Really focusing inwardly on what's good for China, but not really caring about how this would play out elsewhere. And then beyond that, sought to capitalize politically and diplomatically through mask diplomacy and all these other things to try to show that China, and even though it was the origin of the pandemic, was also better capable of dealing with the pandemic than anyone else, and to assert its leadership there. So both sides have managed this horribly, and I don't perceive that that's improving. Certainly not quickly. I mean, that has not changed. I think the United States actually has a huge opportunity to do a great deal better than it has, but still has a way to go. And the one area I would point to on vaccine diplomacy is, it's now increasingly clear that the United States has and will have stockpiled a great deal more vaccine than it actually needs to treat the American public. So the next question is going to be, will the Biden administration have the be able to harness that to demonstrate a magnanimous and compassionate approach to the rest of the world, and have the resources to do it. And it's not just a decision for the Biden administration, although it starts there. It's also, how will the American public respond? How will the US Congress respond? Would we fund this sort of thing? A major worldwide approach that would start with American leadership, maybe be financed in cooperation with others, including Japan, rely perhaps in the future increasingly on Indian production of vaccine, although India is now facing its own domestic needs increasingly, and so that's up in the air. Anyway, there's an opportunity there, for the United States to reassert itself, and maybe over time even to come together in something that would bring China along cooperatively as well. But frankly, I don't see that at the moment.
Yes, I think that makes sense. On the note of vaccines, I think India's own policy was very magnanimous and appreciated, but I think it sort of overestimated the amount of vaccines it would need, and there are already sort of shortages, and the current wave that's going on in India has shown that things are getting pretty bad. So, I just honestly don't know how things are going. But I guess none of
Well,
us
yeah,
can
just
tell.
sorry on that. I mean, and everything else, what just broadly, right? We're seeing a world that countries are in grappling with a shared threat, the tendency led by the United States and China, but everybody else is involved. The tendency has been to turn inward, and to see this as a treat ourselves first, a kind of problem. And I don't think that, I think that's probably in any circumstance, that's the more likely outcome. I'm not 100% sure that would have been the necessary outcome. And I think that both American and Chinese leadership are to blame in many important ways for the way that this has played out.
Fair enough. I'm going to turn a little bit away from sort of East Asia and China now and talk about a space that I think often has to jostle for attention in terms of American foreign policy. And that's broader policy towards South Asia. I think it often feels like countries in the region often feel like they're caught between sort of the Middle East and East Asia, and therefore need to sort of vie for attention in terms of American foreign policy. Biden announced a couple of days ago a complete withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan by 9/11, by September the 11th. And this is, I think, going to significantly shake things up in South Asia and also sort of affect China. What is your take on sort of Biden's move?
Well, even though it's been 20 years in the making, this was still an important announcement. And it still came as, I don't want to say a surprise, but if you had done a survey of foreign policy experts, I think all of them would have said there's zero chance that the Biden administration would ramp up again in Afghanistan. There's a halfway decent chance that they'll try to find a way to maintain an indefinite presence, low-level military presence in Afghanistan. And then there's a small but significant chance that they will really rip off the Band-Aid, so to speak, or and withdraw more rapidly. And so this was not, I think, the most likely outcome. The other day there was a piece in I guess it was in the Washington Post or the New York Times. They accused the Biden administration of taking the easy way out in Afghanistan, and I don't agree that this was the easy way out. In a sense, it's easy, right? Because you're withdrawing your forces. But, 3 presidents before Biden were unwilling or unable for strategic or political reasons to take this so-called easy way out. If it was that easy, I have no doubt the Trump administration would have done it. They have no qualms for breaking things and changing and, surprising the world. So if it was so easy, they would have done it. They didn't. I think this is, so in that respect, it's a little bit surprising. I think that there's a long history here of Biden's views about Afghanistan. He was always skeptical. I actually remember participating in a dinner conversation. The only time I've really had a conversation with now President Biden was on Afghanistan. And his views, this was all the way back in the early period of the Obama administration, his views as vice president were quite clear that, America's ability to shape or remake Afghanistan exceptionally limited, and the costs in terms of U.S. military costs, financial costs were extremely high, and that he was grasping for some other means to achieve what he perceived were relatively narrow U.S. goals in Afghanistan. And I don't think that his view has changed much, if at all, since then, except to say that he's probably more frustrated by the limited consequences of continued U.S. efforts and expenditures in Afghanistan. It really doesn't look a heck of a lot better now than it did a decade ago or nearly a decade ago. Our counterterror concerns are not limited to Afghanistan, a point that he's made. We face terrorist threats from elsewhere too. And a continued military presence, he's still convinced, isn't the best, or at least not the only way, the most cost-efficient way to address those threats. So, it's going to have huge knock-on effects for, of course, the people of Afghanistan, for Pakistan, for the wider region. A lot of these are kind of unknowable still at this point because, for every step that the Taliban may take, there will be a response from others and vice versa. So this is a kind of a strategic and iterative consequences will flow from this, which makes it unpredictable. But we can definitely say that it's a significant turning of the page. And, coming with U.S.-China policy that we've talked about, but also U.S. policy on Iran, this has been a pretty momentous couple of weeks, the U.S. policy toward Russia. The Biden administration is really starting to put its mark on American foreign policy in ways that, took a few months being in office, but now a direction is more and more clear. And this is a really important part of that story.
When you say a direction is more and more clear, what direction broadly do you think that is, if you had to characterize Biden's foreign policy?
I think there is much greater, again, something that I was saying in the China competition context, much greater emphasis, certainly than the Trump administration, on multilateralism, the expectation that the United States doesn't need to go it alone, and broadly that the first order of business should be to attempt not to go it alone in these instances, that we, United States, do not need to shoulder every burden, but that doesn't mean isolating ourselves or retreating from leadership, right? So it's the multilateralizing of American efforts and trying to de-emphasize to some extent the purely military component, trying to re-emphasize, maybe to put it in a positive way, the diplomacy side of things. Biden has put one of his closest confidants in as Secretary of State. Secretary Blinken is somebody who, I think probably has as much of a mind meld or understanding of what's going on in the president's mind as anybody else. He's worked with him for so long. And so there's a lot of trust there. There's a goal to rebuild the State Department and to use it much more extensively than I think, prior administrations have been inclined to do, where, the American military is a huge tool in our kit. And so it tends to be the one that most presidents turn to first. In a sense, I think the Biden administration is actually trying to reverse that and to say the first tool in our kit is, the State Department or associated, diplomatic approaches. That seems to be, if I'm trying to pull the pieces together, right, it's an emphasis on returning to talks, whether it's Paris climate talks or Iran JCPOA talks, or, even in terms of dealing with Russia, the message is one of kind of, we're going to be tough, but we're not going to try to go to war with you. This isn't principally a military approach. This is a more diplomatic one. And on Afghanistan, I think the diplomacy has been frustrating, and so they want to keep at it, but they don't feel like throwing more money and lives into the military approach.
This is very interesting on two counts. So my first is sort of Afghanistan specific, and I think, as you sort of mentioned, negotiations with the Taliban haven't sort of gone anywhere in the last couple of months, the last couple of years even, perhaps. So is sort of the US reconciled to the fact that the Taliban at some point might take government in Afghanistan and then they'll just have to deal with it at a state level? So that is the first half of my question. I think the second half of it is more to do with what you'd mentioned with China and sort of the US wanting to regain its position on the global stage. There has been a trust deficit, I think, from the parts of other countries, particularly under the Trump administration, where they felt that the US was not perhaps doing enough or as much as it was earlier. So do you think that diplomacy is the way that the Biden administration wants to sort of perhaps plug the trust deficit, if it wants to do that at all?
Yeah. So just on the Taliban front, I think that the Biden administration is, I'm sure, in a sense, divided on both their expectations for what will emerge in Afghanistan and even what they would be willing or okay with accepting. Um, just after the president made his announcement of the troop withdrawal, Secretary Blinken visited Afghanistan and voiced continued support and commitment to the government in Kabul, suggesting that I think the intention very clearly was we're not walking away from President Ghani, from the Afghan government, from the state that is in place. That our commitment to withdrawing our military does not necessarily mean that we are signing up to a new Taliban-led regime or resigned to the idea that, within a matter of months, the Taliban will sweep into Kabul and take over the whole place. That no, we actually, our first goal would, quite to the contrary, be to enable others in Afghanistan, including this Afghan government, to withstand the threat posed by the Taliban, but just not on the backs of US military forces. Now, there are some questions there, right? Like legitimate questions about whether that's realistic. I think a lot of folks looking at this who are more expert than I am on the military situation will say that the Afghan national security forces are not up to that task. And moreover, that the history of Afghanistan is one in which when the tides turn decisively to one side in a military context, the other side is more inclined to fold than it is to stand its ground and continue to fight. So now these are unknowns. As I said before, there's a kind of a back and forth strategically. If the Taliban start to push too hard, then you will probably see a response from what we used to call the Northern Alliance, with backers potentially from Iran, from Russia, maybe from India, maybe from the United States, right? So there are ways to push back against the Taliban that do not include US military power. In a more narrow sense, there are even some questions about whether US contractors and others may continue to stay in Afghanistan even after all US military has left. Now, that's, I think, still up in the air. So, there will be enabling capabilities. In other words, American power, but not American military power. It's a distinction, but, it's one that could have a meaningful consequence. Anyway, so I don't think we should interpret this as we're walking away, we're okay with, the Biden administration is fine, whether it's the Taliban or Ashraf Ghani or anybody else, he really doesn't care. No, I don't think it's that. But I think that they're clearly also willing to run that risk. They know, they have been told 1,000 times that that is a risk of what they're doing. The new director of the CIA, William Burns, has made that point in testimony just this past week, that that is possible, right? That we are taking on a greater risk, not only of Taliban extending its hold, but that they would even provide safe haven to international terrorists like Al-Qaeda again. And the Biden administration's response is, yes, that is a risk. That is a risk that we face in some other countries, whether in Africa or in the Middle East. We will address that threat in ways that look more like what we're doing in these other countries than what we've done in Afghanistan, because the other risk is we just keep doing what we're doing. And that's not working. And we know that. And we're not going to do more. There's no American appetite for doing more. So the only question is how much less and for how long. Anyway, so that's I think how I have to interpret the Taliban story. In terms of trust deficit on American presence, first of all, there's a connection here to Afghanistan, which is the American military, the U.S. government, not willing to continue its commitment to a government that it effectively put into place in Kabul. What does that say to other countries in the world in terms of can they trust the United States? Is Biden stepping away from that actually sacrificing a degree of American credibility elsewhere. And there, I think, look, what other country would have expended probably trillions of dollars, lost thousands of lives to try to back up landlocked Afghanistan for 20 years? I don't think that after 20 years, this is a sign of no American credibility. I think that I think it'll be interpreted. I think other states and their leaders will see the nuance here and appreciate that this is a more complicated story than America just sort of cutting and running from a threat. And maybe some of them will see it as maybe America waking up to a practical downside or consequences of its involvement in a very difficult country, and maybe even giving the United States the benefit of the doubt for being wise in that approach. That's possible. I don't see it as a huge killer of American credibility. The Trump administration's approach, though, to large parts of the world and American presence in multilateral organizations and showing up to a variety of other meetings and events and everything, that was a threat to American leadership. And I do think created questions about whether the United States was trustworthy. At the very least, during the Trump years, and this was one thing that was so disheartening to many of us in the United States, was our president could not be taken at his word. So, you honestly, if you met with the man and he said something, you could not be certain that he wouldn't walk out of the meeting and say something completely different or entirely fabricate what might have happened in that meeting altogether. That is the very low bar for establishing trust that the Trump administration couldn't even find its way over. The Biden administration is going back to a much more traditional approach, which I think will give at least that level of confidence that when they say something, they actually meant to say it generally. Otherwise, it was a mistake, a real mistake, not an intentional lie or fabrication. That will go some way to restoring a degree of trust. But I wouldn't want to underestimate the damage of the past 4 years in terms of just this lingering suspicion in the minds even of America's closest allies and partners that if we could elect a Trump once, what's to say we won't do something like that again? So is Biden a return to stable American leadership or another, halfway decent few years of normalcy before we go off the deep end again? And, as an American, I'm worried about that too. And so we've got a lot to do domestically in terms of our own politics to make sure that doesn't happen again. But we have to be realistic that the rest of the world is watching very closely and has good reason to be quite skeptical about trusting us, not just for during the Biden administration, but beyond that, which is really important for global leadership because a lot of the decisions that we make have repercussions that extend beyond a single presidency.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think, I want to sort of round off all of this by coming back to India. And I think we spoke about this earlier in the conversation with respect to Quad. But where do you see sort of India in Biden's larger Asia policy? We spoke a little bit about how India is not a traditional ally. It prefers not to be, in a sense. So how do you see sort of India within Biden's foreign policy?
Well, as I think I mentioned a bit, India has, for the Biden administration, taken on a very similar place as it did for the previous 3 administrations, at least going back to the Bush administration, and in some ways with some origins even in the Clinton administration, but basically a big strategic bet that India is an enormous country that has incredible potential economically, diplomatically, even militarily, and that as a counterweight to China in Asia, it is indispensable, it is unique, and it is worthy of considerable American attention and investment. So all those things continue to hold. And as we were talking about before, by this focus on the Quad early on, this was partly a doubling down, so not just on traditional allies like Japan and Australia, but also including India in that. And the Quad, in a way, one of the things I didn't say before is, in a way, it's a helpful vehicle for reinforcing U.S.-India ties, but in a plurilateral, multilateral context that may be less threatening to India than a simple bilateral relationship or anything that screams nascent alliance, which India, for historical reasons as well as for its own kind of strategic aims, is inclined to avoid. And again, I think is likely to continue to be inclined to avoid. Now, having said all of that, there are some problems. The US-India relationship is not just smooth sailing. And a lot of that has to do with India's own trajectory, decisions being made by India's leadership, having to do with, at one level, economic policy, questions about whether India can, in the relative near term or the medium term, live up to some of its potential economically, see growth rates that will allow, permit it to be, an engine of Asian economic growth, and so that will make India into the great economy, that Americans believe that it ought to be, and that's part of the strategic bet we're placing on India, a place where we would like to invest, where we would like to see returns on investment, but where also India will be a buyer of American goods and a seller to the United States, to the US market. And, it's been slow going on the economic front. And India hasn't seen that spectacular growth that would propel it forward in these ways. So that's just one area. Well, the other one is on the political side. India's trajectory. Look, when I worked in the Bush administration, I have to admit I was non-political, but I was there in the State Department in the Bush administration at the time of the civil nuclear deal with India. And a big part of what we talked about at the time was shared democratic values. And this is a very long conversation that we could have, but one of the questions is India domestically on a trajectory that will continue to lead Americans and Indians to think of themselves as having shared values, liberal values, democratic values, and will that be a glue that binds them together, or will that just be a kind of not so important? Mainly, we're strategic partners in dealing with a threat posed by a growing China. Those are different kinds of relationships. It's evolving, and but those are the kinds of things that have potential for bringing friction. A last one would simply be, we, the United States and India, do not see all other countries in the world the same. So maybe if we're increasingly seeing China as a strategic competitor or even threat, but we may not see Iran the same way. We don't seem to see Russia the same way. If India buys a S-400 air defense system from Russia and the United States decides to slap sanctions on India for doing so, does that create another point of friction between the United States and India? So there are a lot of some legacy issues, some economic issues, some emerging political issues that, raise questions about how smooth the trajectory forward of US-India ties will be, what kind of strategic partnership this is likely to be over time.
No, I think it's important that you brought these up. It's very easy when we talk about US-India relations, particularly now, to forget that the two countries weren't sort of on the best of terms through the Cold War, and this relationship is rather new in that sense. So I agree with you. There are a lot of issues domestically for both countries to figure out, as well as within the relationship. And that sort of brings me to my last question, and this is something that I ask all of my guests. But what books or resources would you recommend for anyone who's interested more in Biden's Asia policy or the Quad or American foreign policy in general? What would you recommend?
Well, at the risk of shilling my own stuff, I'd say read my book. So we'll start there. Mm-hmm. And we haven't really talked so much about this, but if you're interested in sort of China's relations with countries to its west, to Pakistan, on through Central Asia and to the Middle East, then that's why I've written this book. And certainly an American perspective on that, but I think should hold some wider appeal. But in terms of other people's work, I have friends and colleagues in Washington, D.C. who I rely upon. We talked a lot about the Quad. And if you're looking for somebody who's following that issue closely, Tanvi Madan at Brookings has written extensively on this. She's a great resource. She's following it really closely, so she's an easy Twitter follow. You can check out some of her stuff she's at Brookings, on the Brookings website. She and Dhruva Jaishankar just have a piece out in Foreign Affairs on the Quad. They take a pretty bullish approach, what the Quad should be, what it can be, what it ought to be. And for a kind of a counter perspective on this, I thought there was a really great, at least thought-provoking essay also in Foreign Affairs by Van Jackson, who I don't know personally, but who basically is saying, this whole Indo-Pacific scheme is a folly, is a overreach by the United States, and is pulling together disparate regions in ways that will ultimately be strategically counterproductive and come at some risk and cost. And so I think reading those two together, sort of those who really see the Indo-Pacific as the way to go and the Quad as a vehicle for promoting a useful and effective counterbalancing mechanism to the rise of China, and then somebody who says, not so fast. Appreciate that this is a huge region, and that sometimes it's useful for the United States and American policymakers to differentiate between different regions and to appreciate that prioritizing different parts of the U.S. interests is more important is the way to go. So I would read those two together and come to your own conclusions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. All of Dan's recommendations are in the episode bio, so do check those out. If you have any questions about the Indo-Pacific or Quad in particular, or about foreign policy in general, then you can send them across. On next week's episode, I'll answer listener questions about global affairs and international relations. So you can email me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com or slide into my DMs on Instagram at States of Anarchy or on Twitter at HumsniH. If you want to show us some love, send this episode to someone who you think may enjoy it. You can also leave us a rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. If you want to be more involved, check out our Insta page where we post regularly about foreign policy. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app or website, but whatever podcast app is out there under the sun. We will be back next Tuesday.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IBM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset, and everything sport.
So tune in to The Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.